Jeff, before the break, we were talking about your, perhaps we might say, your quixotic adventures around the country, promoting the idea that cities might be interested in a cities program. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess the first thing I have to say about all of that was that for whatever reason, I always decided to make these speeches without clearing them with anybody. I didn't know whether that was a good idea or a bad idea, but my history in government had always been to just, I could see that, as I was saying before, if you had the word secretary in your title, people paid attention to what you said when you made a speech. And then I noticed that when people paid attention and when reporters actually wrote it down, whether in a real newspaper or the trade press, people began to think that that was U.S. government policy. And so sort of accidentally, I found out that I could make a lot of U.S. government policy just by saying that was what it was. And I didn't start out quite that robustly. I was going around to a lot of communities where my perception was that they were not paying very much attention to the bilateral negotiating process, that we were doing agreements with a lot of trading partners where an airline from another country wanted to fly to Phoenix or Atlanta or Houston. And our airlines would say, well, we don't really need anything from them right now, so let's just wait. Let's wait until we want something, and then we can give them some new route rights. And so the net result was, our negotiating policy was, you cities can't have new economic opportunities of this magnitude until such time as we are given permission by U.S. airlines to grant you those connections. I made a speech in Atlanta where we were having a problem. Swiss Air wanted very much to fly to Atlanta. Atlanta wanted Swiss Air very much to fly to Atlanta. But we were having a problem with Zurich. Zurich was treating our airlines badly. They were concerned about security. They were putting their counters behind some big wall, and we had to solve that problem. And until we solved that problem, Atlanta would not have that nonstop service between Atlanta and Switzerland. No U.S. carrier was offering that service. U.S. carriers didn't want Swiss Air having any of that service. And the net result was, because of the nature of the bilateral negotiating process, Atlanta was basically being held high and dry. That was the story I was telling, and I told it in Atlanta, I told it in Houston, I told it in Phoenix, and eventually what you began to see, I mean, lobbyists don't take long to figure out where there might be an opportunity. A bunch of lobbyists decided to organize the cities, create a political force in favor of actually looking at the larger economic benefit of international air service, and that began to change the drill a little bit. And once that happened, well, the speeches I'm talking about I was making when I was a career Deputy Assistant Secretary of State conducting these negotiations. Mm-hmm. When I moved over back to the Department of Transportation under Secretary Sam Skinner, that, as I said, was my first political appointment. And at that point, and I knew Sam Skinner was a courageous leader. He was interested in doing interesting things with his time at the Department of Transportation. And I suggested to him that it doesn't make the slightest bit of policy sense for us not to allow a foreign carrier who's given us all that they have to give to fly to a U.S. city that they want to fly to, where no U.S. carrier is offering service to that city, between that city and that country. Didn't make the slightest bit of sense for us to say no to that. What were we trying to achieve? We were not seeking anything. We were, in effect, waiting until we had something that we were seeking, and then that was the policy. We'd give it to them when we had something that we could get in return, partly driven by that crazy language that was in IATCA that we talked about earlier. So I said, why don't we craft a policy whereby if a foreign carrier has basically given us everything that there is to give, a foreign government has nothing more, there's no discrimination, they're a liberal partner of ours, they've answered all of our questions, yes, they want to fly to a U.S. city that no U.S. carrier is serving, why do we have to have a negotiation about that? Why don't we just say, sure? Sam thought that was an intriguing idea, much to my astonishment.
Did you have the statutory authority to do that?
I thought we did. I thought we did because in that provision of IATCA that said we had to get as good as we were giving in our negotiations, remember I said that there were those little words at the end that said, or for the benefit of travelers or
traveling public.
The traveling public, thank you. And that traveling public language was the hook that we were able to hang this innovation on. He was intrigued with it. We put out a notice proposing it. There were lots of comments, pro and con, and we decided that we had the legal authority, thanks to those words. There was enough to be said about doing it. The community seemed to be pretty enthusiastic about it, so we actually issued an order saying there would be this new program called the Underserved Cities Program, which later became
to give it its full title.
Yeah, and it was called the Cities Program.
So you were giving hard rights free of charge. Is that a fair characterization?
Is a very fair characterization. That's precisely how it was characterized by our airline friends. Yes.
And what was your response to the airlines?
My response to the airlines was, it's not all about you.
Which had been a theme, I think, since the time you arrived.
Right. Yeah, just one little quick anecdote about all of that. You know, we issued that final order in establishing the cities program. One of the first airlines to come through the door, much to my dismay at the time, of course, was KLM from the Netherlands. KLM was problematic in the sense that they didn't actually carry people from Holland to the U.S. They carried people from everywhere else in the world to the U.S. They were treated by the rest of the industry as essentially pirates. In the lingo of the day, we called them a sixth freedom carrier, right?
The Emirates of their day.
Right. Anyway, they qualified under the rules that we had written, and so we really had no alternative but to say, yes, you want to serve a city in the U.S. that's not getting service? You may. And they did. And they chose BWI, Baltimore Washington International Airport, as their first destination under the cities program. The people running BWI asked me if I would come and represent the U.S. Department of Transportation at the ribbon cutting when the first flight arrived. And I said, sure, that'd be a lot of fun. And so on the fated day, I got into one of the DOT cars and was being driven to the airport, about 45 minutes from DOT headquarters. And I was working on my remarks, not paying attention to where we were, and suddenly the car stopped. And I kind of came out of my, reverie. The driver said, "We're here." And I looked out the window, and we were right in front of the terminal, and I could see behind the terminal this sky blue 747 with KLM painted on the side. I mean, it was a very large airplane that was sitting there because of a memorandum which I had written to Sam Skinner at one point. And I thought, this doesn't happen very often in public service, when you actually see palpable results from a memo you write. Normally the result is somebody says, "Hey, nice memo." A 747 was sitting there because we had changed policy.
It was remarkable.
It was stunning, and needless to say, Brian, I was very full of myself that day.
As you deserve to be. But Jeff, could an official in a comparable position today perform this campaign that you did in the late 1980s?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons that I think this whole story is so interesting, is because we have some huge challenges in our transportation system today, particularly on the infrastructure side. The Highway Trust Fund is bankrupt, something we've relied on for decades for our fundamental circulatory system as an economy. And nobody, there's a lot of reports, lots of studies have been done, lots of solutions have been offered, but you don't see any of the ferment taking place in Washington today that's going to actually produce a comparable change. We need, as I was saying earlier, we need that fundamental change in approach, and I'm not sure at this point where it's coming from. So it's interesting to look back and see what the ingredients were that facilitated the kind of change we're talking about in international air transport, because I think there are lessons there for what's going on today.
Is it also fair to say that the cities program sprang from your mind as a reaction to your experience with the bilateral negotiating process? You saw this lacuna, you saw this gap, and you thought it could be filled almost by administrative fiat without going back to Congress and having new legislation and so forth. It was an opportunity for some creative activity.
That's a very positive and sort of a laudable way to put it, and I'd be very proud if that were the instinct that actually led to the cities program. But actually it was a fear of having to make another speech to another city and being hugely embarrassed by having to say to the city fathers of another great state capital that we have an airline out there that actually wants to provide you this huge economic benefit by flying every day from another country, but we're not going to let that happen because we have a doing business problem that we have to solve first. I was really tired of having to
So
explain.
municipal leaders were not just mobilized after the event, they were already lobbying the DOT with respect to service.
Well, they weren't very effective lobbyists, I would say, but they were able to give us support. There was at least a source of support in the docket
Yeah.
when we proposed the city's program. It wasn't all lopsided in favor of airlines that were opposed to the deal. We at least had some comments that we could point to, because you go through the comments and you say, here are the pros and here are the cons, and on balance we find that we like the ones that are in favor of the program better, and that's becomes the rationale. If we didn't have that support in the docket, it would have been much more difficult to simply blow off all of the opposition, have no particular support, and nevertheless go ahead and do it. So
Now, the foreign carriers at this point, Jeff, were not code-sharing with any American carriers. Is that correct?
Well, I said earlier that the foreign carriers were increasingly cross with the U.S., and foreign governments were, because they felt that U.S. carriers were really having their way with them and doing so much better in the competition. And a very important reason for that was precisely that international code sharing was not allowed. Domestic code sharing had been begun. I mean, we were seeing interline connections were being turned into fictional online connections by virtue of people sharing codes. But a Lufthansa coming to Chicago and wanting, for example, to put its code on United Airlines flight between Chicago and Orlando, that would not have been allowed.
Well, how do you mean it wasn't allowed? Was there a statutory bar, or was it something you just didn't negotiate at the time?
First of all, it was prohibited as a matter of domestic regulation. It wasn't something that was covered in the statute. Domestic regulation, U.S. aviation regulation, had finally opened up to the point where it over a lot of dead bodies, this was highly controversial, it allowed the domestic carriers, in the context of domestic flying, to code share. You remember Bob Crandall, whom you've interviewed, made a huge campaign of saying this was deceptive, this was deceiving consumers. And of course he was right until such time as DOT then required absolute disclosure of code sharing opportunities. But even when the DOT finally allowed code sharing on domestic routes, it didn't go so far as to allow international code sharing. And so that was yet another obstacle to foreign carriers being able to operate in real competition with their U.S. domestic competitors, who had the feed coming off of these hub and spoke systems, who could basically serve any point in the interior United States with an online connection. Foreign carriers could only serve the gateways they've been allowed to serve.
Bob Crandall's exact words were organized lying. That's what he said in his conversation with us.
Yeah, and I think in the beginning it's not unfair to say that it was. He had a strong point, because disclosure wasn't required in the first instance. But once it was required, there was no more lying. There were simply much more convenient services available to the public.
Well, as we move to talk about open skies after 1992, would you say that the Underserved Cities program was an essential prerequisite, precondition necessary to open skies? Could open skies have happened without the Underserved Cities program?
I'm not really sure. I think that the Underserved Cities program helped us break the back of an assumption that would have been treated as antithetical to open skies up until that time, and that was the notion that you could give hard rights, real route opportunities away to a foreign carrier in return for nothing, which was precisely what the cities program was doing.
Yeah.
That we were able to get away with it, that we were able to articulate a rationale and an interpretation of that provision of IATCA that was consistent with the idea of giving hard rights away and not getting any hard rights for the U.S. carrier. By definition, we were only allowed to do it when the U.S. carrier had all the hard rights the other side had to give. So of course we couldn't get any more for them. But until we were able to articulate that rationale and that interpretation, I think open skies would have been impossible to do.
So what's going on in your mind around this time? You've got your signature of the Secretary on the Underserved Cities program. What are you going to do next?
What I'm going to do next is try to figure out how to jumpstart the negotiating process, because the Underserved Cities program was not about negotiations. It was about creating opportunities for communities without the negotiating process. The negotiating process had all but dried up for all the reasons I've explained. The foreign carriers saw coming to the U.S. as just an opportunity to get their clocks cleaned by these creatures of the deregulated market that we had here. They couldn't compete. They didn't have hub and spoke systems in the United States because of the cabotage rule. We wouldn't let them code share. Even after we let them code share to some extent, they still couldn't compete very effectively because we didn't really have these integrated alliances that made those code sharing opportunities really work.
Was the Heathrow succession agreement initialed around this time? I think it was 1991. Were you involved in that?
Very much involved in that. Yeah, I think I can't remember exactly which year, but it would have been around the same time.
Yeah.
But again, I still see the UK-US relationship, again, as in a separate compartment. That, I mean, the UK was always different. And it wasn't necessarily part of this. The UK had indicated no interest whatsoever in doing an open skies agreement with the United States. So we ended up having to do another agreement we didn't like in order to get the right to put United in place of Pan Am, to put American in place of TWA because of that Bermuda 2.5 agreement that said it had to be Pan Am or TWA or nobody. But that was a kind of a sport on the
True, compartmentalized, but it must have frustrated you at the time.
Well, that was a hugely frustrating thing. It was frustrating, of course, for the carriers involved. But you know, the UK was within its rights to say you can't substitute stronger airlines for weaker ones at Heathrow without our permission because of the agreement that we had signed.
And why do you think the Thatcher administration, being so free market oriented, took this protectionist approach?
You have to psychoanalyze a lot of people in the UK to understand that. I think, notwithstanding the Thatcher government's approach, they wanted to privatize British Airways. They had privatized
They had done so.
the airport's authority, and it was very important in the interest of continuing the privatization route which Margaret Thatcher put the UK government on, that these be treated as success stories. And my interpretation is that if they had opened the floodgates to real competition for BA in the immediate aftermath of privatization, when of course it was going through a huge internal upheaval by virtue of this privatization, they would have put the privatization of BA, that particular entity, at risk to an extent that they couldn't measure. And to that extent, if BA were to fail by virtue of its inability to actually operate in a competitive market for the first time, and who knew whether it could, putting the entire Thatcher program at risk.
Right.
So I sort of understood that the real competition to and from the UK was going to be beyond reach for a while. We didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it.
Did you ever consider denouncing Bermuda 2, as
No.
Bob Crandall proposed, for example, at the time?
Never did, because again, first of all, it was the special relationship. I didn't think there'd be any interest in doing that. There was Crandall talked about denouncing Bermuda 2 during the Clinton years. I wasn't in government at that time. But if you look back at the Clinton years, you remember what was going on between the U.S. and the U.K. I think Bill Clinton invited Jerry Adams to the White House for a while. John Major wouldn't return Clinton's phone call for several days because he was so furious that we were talking to Sinn Féin at this really dramatic moment in U.K. history and all that was going on Northern Ireland. To denounce the bilateral agreement pursuant to which air transportation took place between the two countries wasn't a point that I would have raised had I been in government at that particular moment, nor it wouldn't have been taken seriously.
Well, all these things were in your mind as you thought to yourself, how do we change this process, this negotiating process? So how did Open Skies emerge from the ferment?
Well, I asked the staff to really do a quantitative study of what was really going on. How were U.S. carriers doing in the liberal agreements that we had? How are foreign governments doing? How are foreign carriers doing? How are our cities doing? We put on essentially what would be today a PowerPoint presentation. I think we used Harvard graphics at the time. Whatever happened to Harvard graphics? Anyway, it was a pretty powerful demonstration. Number one, the airlines through the 80s had, as I think I said earlier, had profited enormously. They had made record profits through the 80s, and largely that was, I'm just talking about the international markets now.
The U.S. airlines.
U.S. airlines had done very, very well thanks to the liberal agreements that we had put in place over their dead bodies. That was an interesting little revelation.
Yeah.
They had hated the whole idea of liberalizing these markets. We did, and then they just rode roughshod over the competition once they had the opportunities that those agreements created. Foreign carriers were increasingly upset, and their market shares were diminishing, and they knew it, and they were getting very cross with their own governments for not negotiating more effectively on their behalf. And we had begun to see some real renunciations. You remember that there was a big downturn in the early 90s in terms of the economies, and everybody pulled back in terms of transatlantic capacity because the traffic wasn't there. And then the economy came back, I think, in 1992, and we had an agreement with France, just to take one example, which enabled us, it was a liberal agreement, as we defined liberal agreements in those days. It enabled the carriers to put in whatever capacity they wanted. The U.S. carriers felt that there was a lot of pent-up demand for travel to and from France, and so they announced new schedule increases for, I think, the summer season in 1992. The French went crazy because Air France went crazy. They thought they were going to be wiped from the face of the earth by this darkening of the skies over Paris by U.S. airlines, and so they threatened to renounce the agreement. This became a diplomatic issue, and in fact, Secretary of State James Baker ended up having to take this up in conversations with his counterpart, the Foreign Minister of France at the time. And the idea was that we would cut back on our capacity if the French would stay in the agreement. He came back saying that that was the agreement. I had to go to all the U.S. airlines and plead with them to cut back on capacity, which they had every right to introduce into France under the bilateral agreement at the time. They did so, and then the French renounced anyway. And there were a lot of other threats to renounce because just as had been the case with Bermuda too, our trading partners felt that they weren't getting a fair shake, that they couldn't compete with U.S. carriers that were coming out of these hub and spoke systems for a whole variety of reasons. So what we were facing, therefore, was a real diminution in the quality of air service that was designed to benefit U.S. communities and the U.S. national economy at large. That was the case we ended up making, first to Sam Skinner and then ultimately to Andrew Card, who was Sam's successor as Secretary of Transportation, and which was bought. I said the only way to really jumpstart this process is to basically say we don't have any interest in limiting the access of foreign airlines to any place in the U.S. market. We don't have to calibrate their access to the U.S. market as long as they have given us all there is to give. As long as they have opened their markets to the extent that they can open those markets, there's nothing for us to negotiate for. Why would we not begin to take advantage at long last of the larger economic significance of international air services for the benefit of communities, for the benefit of the U.S. economy, for the benefit of travelers everywhere? And I sent a memorandum to Secretary Skinner, I remember. I can't remember exactly what month or what year, but it was after discussing this concept internally and with the Department of State for a while, saying that we really should be mature enough to actually begin to look askance at this way of calibrating international aviation markets at long last. There seemed to be, certainly at the working level and at my level, there was a lot of interest in moving forward. I described this little concept in a 3-paragraph memorandum to Secretary Skinner. Sent it to him. A memorandum like that, you would not have been wrong to expect that a 6-month process of meetings and analysis would have been launched by a memorandum like that. Let's really calibrate as carefully as we can what the costs and benefits of a change like that would be. In the case of Secretary Skinner, the memorandum came back from his secretary the next morning, and scribbled in the margin was, "Go for it!" Exclamation point, yes. I still have a copy of it. That was a miraculous moment in my government career because I had never seen that sort of decisiveness, that sort of vision come from any cabinet member before. Not to draw invidious comparisons. We've had great members of the cabinet and some great secretaries of transportation. But that gave us the confidence to move this thing forward. Of course, we had to do it deliberately. We had to have a notice of proposed policy, put it out for notice and comment.
You defined open skies. You had to
defining open skies, finding out what people thought about it. We had pros and cons again in the comments. But by and large, nobody really laid a glove on it. At this point in our history, it just seemed like it was time to do it. And
You must have had the credibility to put this memo before Skinner and to have him adopt it so rapidly.
Well, he must have felt I had the credibility because he bought it. And in fact, the very idea of transitioning from a career position like the one I had had at the Department of State, where I was a civil servant in effect, to a presidential appointment under Sam Skinner as an Assistant Secretary of Transportation, that was pretty unusual. And I attribute that to his clarity. I mean, as he came to the job, he had a whole variety of things that he was interested in achieving, and he knew that personally he didn't have a lot of personal strength in understanding how international aviation markets had worked, and he had been hearing a lot about international aviation. So he wanted somebody who had that on his resume, if you will. And thanks to my friend Ellen Craig, I was one of the who is here today, and I'm delighted to see her, who was a member of the Illinois Commerce Commission at the time, I believe. She somehow found out that Sam Skinner, a scion of Chicago, a member of the Institute's Board of Advisors, was going to be the next Secretary of Transportation. I was the first, thanks to Ellen, the first person in Washington to know that other than George H.W. Bush. At least I think I was. And so I vectored my resume toward Sam Skinner in 16 different ways, trying to make sure that at least he knew that I had this in my background. I didn't know what he was looking for. And then I finally got an interview with him, and it turned out that it went well. I didn't know for the next 3 months whether I was going to get the job. In fact, I was just reading Aviation daily and finding out who was going to get the job. It was everybody but me. But then he called me one day and said, "I think I got it done." And I said, "You got what done?" He said, "I think I've talked the White House into allowing me to hire you." That was an achievement, no question, because I had been a career civil servant. I could not have helped get George H.W. Bush elected president without having committed a felony, and so I didn't help George Bush get elected president. But nevertheless, that wasn't being held against me, and in fact, the White House personnel operation, I don't think this question ever went to George Bush, the elder George Bush, but the White House personnel operation finally blessed it, but only because Sam Skinner pushed it as hard as he did. So he clearly felt that I knew something about the subject matter, and it, by virtue of all the years that I'd been putting into it, and I guess it was because I was, at that point, his guy, that he was willing to take my recommendation seriously.
Well, let me clarify the timeline. Was he the Secretary of Transportation? Were you rather a political appointee for both of the historic memos that we're talking about? Were you in that same political capacity?
Both historic memos.
The underserved cities and the open skies, the memos that you put on his desk.
Yes. Those were both done at DOT under Secretary Skinner.
How far apart did they occur? Can you remember?
About a year apart.
About a year apart.
Yeah, I think we saw that the underserved cities program would throw off some benefits, but limited benefits. What we really saw, again, was that the system was really drying up in terms of throwing off new opportunities for communities, even for our own airlines, and therefore, once we knew that we could get away, notwithstanding IATCA's language, with giving away hard rights for nothing, it was possible to propose the Open Skies program.
So the same broad interpretation was used.
Yeah, it was validated by the cities program, and we were able to take it forward by articulating it very deliberately and putting it out again for notice and comment. We were able to get validation of that and make it part of our policy. Again, let me just say that in the first instance, Open Skies was being limited just to our European partners, not to the world at large, because we wanted to essentially be able to get our arms around the consequences of this and measure the results before it went any further. And we did, we had a lot of liberal agreements already in Europe. We weren't able to negotiate with our European friends for any new rights for U.S. carriers. They had them all. They even had the ability to fly between European cities. By the way, that was another thing that we were concerned about. Europe was, of course, talking at that point about pulling itself together into a single market. Remember, we thought 1992 was the big year.
Right.
And so we began worrying about what the consequences of that would be. If there were a single market, and if you're going to get into this later, we can postpone this, but it was an important part of the calculus that led to Open Skies. A lot of people in Europe were talking about pulling a single market together as a defensive mechanism, not just to satisfy the Treaty of Rome's requirements and to facilitate inter-carrier competition in a single market in Europe, but because by pulling the single market together in Europe, they would be able to establish that as a cabotage space. And these offensive fifth freedom opportunities, the ability of U.S. carriers to carry traffic between London and Paris, or Paris and Rome, however much they were doing, I don't know, but theoretically they could do it. Those could be taken away, was the theory. I mean, I made a lot of speeches about that at the time as well, and I said, look, these are rights that are enshrined in bilateral agreements that have been signed by sovereign governments, and any effort to take those rights away from the United States, from the U.S. carriers that are enjoying them, will be met with a comparable reduction in your rights. At a time when Europe's approach to international aviation policy and the U.S. approach were finally converging, it would be a very strange result to see us now reducing opportunities on either side, tit for tat. What we should be trying to do is, how do we take these converging policies and manufacture many more opportunities out of them? So worrying about what the single market would portend for U.S. carriers was another reason why we needed to cut ahead of the curve a little bit and try to really change the drill, begin to open up our market, take a lot of the resentment and the arguments that foreign governments were making against us away, and really create a much more contemporary approach to civil aviation than had been the case before.
How did you decide what to include in the template? And why did you decide on a one-size-fits-all approach? Because
Well,
that appears to be what you did.
Well, we insisted that any partner that would be eligible under our policy for an open skies approach would have, by definition, have already given us just about everything they had to give. So they had liberalized, or would be prepared to give us everything they had to give. Again, the route rights were pretty much established. The partners that we knew that would be interested in this, that would negotiate an open skies agreement with us, were already our liberal partners. There was only one thing that was missing from those agreements, and that one thing was the source of all of the resentment that I was increasingly worried about, that I thought would begin to result in a real diminution in the rights of U.S. carriers in international markets, and a real diminution in the benefits of international air transport to U.S. communities, and that was the ability of foreign airlines to serve the U.S. market in any way they chose. That was what was calibrated, that was what was limited by even the liberal agreements that had come out of the Carter administration. We would never say to a foreign airline, if you will deregulate the regulation of pricing, deregulate your regulation of capacity, if you'll allow us any number of airlines and allow us to serve any city in your country, we would never say, in response to that, we'll give you access to the whole U.S. We'd say, we'll give you 2 more gateways.
It was always a gateway policy.
Always a gateway policy, and that all the negotiation was about during those Carter years, when we were beginning the process of liberalizing these agreements, was how many gateways would we have to give them? And the Department of Transportation, this is harkening back to a discussion we had earlier, was often there, again, looking at the incumbents, looking at the Pan Ams, TWAs, the Northwest, and so forth, people that were enjoying these markets, recognizing that they had a big stake in those markets, not wanting to see the floodgates open too suddenly, because they would possibly be driven off these markets by foreign competition. So there was an effort to really calibrate the access which we would give foreign carriers, even in the context of an agreement where the foreign government in question had agreed to liberalize everything for the benefit of U.S. carriers. So the difference between those liberal agreements and the open skies agreements, in my mind, was a single difference. And it was the international opportunities that foreign carriers were given to serve the U.S., the new gateways that foreign carriers would be able to serve in the U.S. And that's why communities around the U.S. were in favor of open skies. That's why we had the broad support for open skies that we did. It was coming out of this cluster of communities that saw, at long last, the federal government would finally be getting out of the way of foreign carriers that wanted to serve them, provided that the foreign carriers came from countries who were sufficiently liberal to justify an open skies approach.
What about the U.S. airlines? They were going through a period of prosperity that was about to change. So were you fortunate that you were able to push this policy through before another period of turbulence occurred?
You never know when their fortunes are about to change.
Right.
And yes, it's a good thing we didn't. U.S. carriers were, I would say, a mixed bag. Mr. Crandall, again, he responded to our open skies agreement with the Dutch, the first one that we were able to do after the policy became the law of the land. Mr. Crandall told me that as a result of that ridiculous policy, and I think I'm paraphrasing, he would have to fire 5,000 people. I didn't think he would have to fire 5,000 people. I thought if he took advantage of these opportunities, he'd probably be hiring 5,000 people. But that was the reaction that I got from him and from a number of other U.S. airlines. It wasn't anything like the reaction to the liberalization that the Carter administration tried to do. It was a muted reaction. I think, even carriers, even executives in the industry who would have been happier not to have seen open skies take place understood that this was where policy was heading. This was the logical conclusion of all the liberalizing we had been doing. At the end of the day, why should governments be trying to figure out, where airplanes should fly? What did these bureaucrats, after all that were doing the negotiations, know about any of that? I think they saw the writing on the wall, and to the extent they did, that they in effect accepted it. There was no blowback that was anything like the blowback which the Carter administration got from its early efforts to liberalize. The paper that went to the Reagan administration that I talked about, the moratorium, the quiescence that we presided over for a number of years. All that.
Did it occur to you at the time that perhaps that the whole bilateral system needed to be shaken up, and that it might be a good approach to try multilateral negotiations with large or larger markets? Canada, the EU, clearly the EU came later.
Sure.
The Maliat came later, the multilateral agreement on air transportation with some small countries. I mean, how free was your thinking at the time in terms of really pushing the paradigm in a different direction?
Well, you could easily envision that multilateral approach, and you could see that perhaps eventually becoming the logical conclusion of all of this ferment. But it was tough enough to just establish an open skies approach to bilateral negotiations. So we wanted to do this in stages. Bilateral liberalization had always been pretty hard. Open skies was a pretty revolutionary approach to what had been a very mercantilistic approach to these negotiations, and just achieving that, which was pretty much toward the end of the first Bush administration, was, we thought, achievement enough for the time being. We knew that, Europe was pulling itself together. We didn't know that it would take 5 more years until 1997 for Europe to pull itself together into that third package, which finally created the single aviation market. But talking about these speeches, I went back and I found one that I delivered to the Wings Club in New York in 1988, and that speech was all about how if we were really serious about liberalizing, now this is 4 years before open skies became a reality. I was at the State Department at the time. It was another one of these speeches that I didn't clear with anybody. I said, number one, we are, as a matter of government policy, putting in place systematically through a process of bilateral negotiations and executive agreements with other governments, we're putting in place restrictions on the operations of international carriers that would be treated as non-tariff barriers and ipso facto unacceptable in any other walk of economic activity.
Right.
That's number one. And number two, if we're ever going to get over this, if we're going to be able to really figure out how to liberalize in a meaningful way, in a multilateral way, if you will, we need a partner on the other side of the table that has a market comparable to ours, that has the negotiating strength comparable to ours, that has an airline industry comparable to ours, and the only one I can think of right now would be the European community. And so in that speech in 1988, I sort of hypothesized a negotiation between the U.S. and Europe for the purpose of trying to articulate a different vision. I was very interested, by the way, in what reaction I would get to that speech, again, which nobody had seen until I gave it. And there was a moment, I will just tell you, that I was walking down the hall in the State Department, and around the corner came my boss, the Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs of the Department of State, Julius Katz. I knew he had read the speech because I had to send it to him. We always sent our speeches to the boss. And I thought, it's showtime now. I'm going to find out whether this was a good idea or a bad idea to make this speech. As Julius approached, he looked at me, and my heart stopped for a moment, and he said, "Good speech." And he walked on. And I walked on, and when I got around the corner, I went. And it was a great moment. I'd gotten away with it. And that sort of became a theme that I then felt comfortable to insert into a lot of other speeches. Again, knowing that every time I made a speech, a lot of people thought that that was actually U.S. policy.
But there must have been some people who were trying to get the ear of the secretary to say, what is Jeff Shane talking about? Why is he making these speeches?
I knew going in that I was part of an administration that would be sympathetic to these views. The issue was not, was this sensible? The issue was there enough of a political reaction to upset the White House, to upset George Shultz, the Secretary of State, who was an economist, by the way, by training. And I don't think, at that stage in our history, remember we had matured, this is 1988, not 1978. I think the industry was beginning to get used to the idea that liberalization was part and parcel of what we were doing. And I, you know, as important as it was, these were nevertheless simply pushing policy in a direction which had already been established. You know, we're talking about credit. I give much more credit to the guys in the Carter administration, to the Mike Levines and the Fred Kahns, than to people in my generation who came along later pushing the envelope, because they were the ones fighting the real resistance. This was hard-fought resistance. You could see reactions, we've talked about them, how hard-fought these battles were, and the quality of the resistance which the airlines were capable of mustering as a political matter. I mean, really swarming over the Congress, swarming over the White House, saying, what are these negotiators doing? We weren't facing anything quite like that. I was much more concerned about, again, this quiescence, this shriveling up of what had been a pretty robust system of opening markets, because our foreign carrier friends and foreign governments, our trading partners, were so convinced that we were enjoying too many benefits in the system that we had created.
Were you ever concerned that by taking the text of IATCA, the benefits of similar magnitude, the language we talked about earlier, traveling public, and by pushing the open skies policy, that you might in fact be thought of as having violated the text in some way, and the courts would end up ruling on open skies?
Well, we had to take it on, and we took it on explicitly in the definitions that we put together, even of the cities program. We essentially pointed to that language, we didn't leave it to chance, and we articulated a particular interpretation that we felt clearly justified the approach we were going. Again, because of those famous words at the end that talked about the benefits to the traveling public that were essentially the essential target here. And so I knew enough about administrative law. I was an administrative lawyer, again. That's how I'd cut my teeth in Washington, to know that if we were able to write that clearly enough, with enough granularity, no court of appeals would ever overturn it. As long as there was substantial evidence, as long as it was not possible to say this was arbitrary and capricious, which it wouldn't have been, because we were pretty careful about it. No court was going to substitute its judgment and say open skies violated the law. But we had to be careful about it. We had to make sure that we covered that very important statutory point, because without that, it would have been a remand. There would have been a do-over. We would have had to do it again.
We'll come back to this in the context of a later notice of proposed rulemaking that you were involved in when you came back to government some decade later. But just before we leave this particular part of the discussion, the Netherlands became the first open skies partner per se.
Yeah.
Was that done while you were still in office?
Yes.
So
yeah.
can you
Summer of 1992.
So that was paving the way. Was it a unique case, or was it your anticipation that this would be the first of many?
Well, I told you about how difficult it was when KLM became our first cities partner beneficiary, cities program beneficiary, because again, they weren't perceived as having an indigenous market of their own, which is a bit of an overstatement, but nevertheless, they did rely heavily on other markets for their prosperity. But in negotiating with friends from the Netherlands over so many years, I had learned a lot from them. I had learned a lot about what international aviation should be, that the models that we had created were, clearly becoming a problem in terms of growing the market. And I knew that having the Dutch be our first open skies partner would present exactly the sort of awkwardness that having them as our first cities program beneficiary presented. But nevertheless, they were courageous enough, knowing that they would be very unpopular within Europe, to do this agreement. It was very important to have an agreement that we could actually point to and say, this open skies thing works. Look what happens as a result. Here's KLM now. They had, I think they were limited to 12 gateways before open skies. As a result of open skies, they had any city in the United States they wanted to serve, and beyond the U.S. to any point in the world. And that began to look very good to a lot of other of our trading partner airlines. Notwithstanding the fact that in some ways the Dutch made for a problematic trading partner for purposes of the first Open Skies Agreement, it was so important that we have one that we didn't spend a lot of time worrying about that very much.
Did you get pushback from U.S. airlines who, I know at the time, were saying we get to fly anywhere in the Netherlands, and the Dutch carriers get to fly anywhere in the United States? I mean, it was an interesting first choice for you.
Well, it was in the sense of the rhetoric surrounding all of this, you couldn't have had a worse first choice, because airlines could say, and without exaggeration, we got nothing out of this agreement. We could already fly to Amsterdam, and Maastricht, don't forget Maastricht. Big cargo point. And that's all we want. And by the way, we can fly beyond. They were allowed to use the Netherlands as a hub even before Open Skies. The Dutch had given us everything that they had to give. They didn't regulate the price of air transportation. They didn't have any limits on entry. They didn't care, what we did, beyond the Netherlands. Or it was a completely open agreement, and the U.S. carriers felt we should stop right there. We don't have to. What is KLM giving us? Is a very important part of the rhetoric, which I felt was a huge problem, and which we really had to respond to dramatically and effectively, and I think we did, was the notion that we would measure the benefits of bilateral negotiations in terms of how many airports we got versus how many airports they got. I mean, if that was your test for a balanced bilateral agreement, we needed to kind of fold up our tent and go home, because there was nobody to negotiate with, right? There was nobody out there that had the number of gateways that we had, so we, by definition, couldn't do an agreement that satisfied IATCA. Certainly not in the Open Skies context. We had to get people to understand this fundamental point. I mean, it's economics 101, but believe it or not, we had to keep saying it over and over again. This negotiation is not about counting airports in their territory and airports in our territory. This is a negotiation about a basket of passengers who want to fly between the two cities, between the two countries. It may be that that country has only one airport. We might have 30 airports, but without that destination, without that one destination, there wouldn't be a basket of passengers. So it's balanced if we have an equal opportunity to serve those passengers. However, hundreds of thousands of passengers a year wanted to fly between our country and theirs, regardless of how many airports they had and how many airports we had. It would be a balanced agreement as long as we had equal opportunity to serve those passengers. And I think that point, which it seemed so obvious, to those of us that were in the business, but was not obvious to members of Congress that kept hearing the rhetoric about, well, how many airports did you get us? How many more destinations did we get? After a while, it finally sank in, and it had to sink in, or we wouldn't have been able to get away with Open Skies.
Why did the Netherlands become the first Open Skies state? Who made the approach? Did they come to you? Did you?
They had always come to us. They were always interested in pushing the envelope. They had always been very creative about how to take air transportation forward. Remember that there were all the rhetoric about pulling the European market together in a single market was in effect defensive rhetoric. It was about finally getting the U.S. to back off and finally cutting back on those Fifth Freedom rights and making sure that we get as good as we're giving. That the U.S. was taking much too much advantage. We were being accused of having picked them off one by one in individual bilateral agreements when they thought of themselves increasingly as a single market. We weren't picking them off. The European Commission had no authority to negotiate with us. They were the only way we could advance the ball was by talking to national states, member states of the European community, of the European Union, because nobody else had the authority to negotiate. Only after 1997 was there a mandate given to Brussels to actually conduct a negotiation with us. Again, I'd been talking about having that negotiation, encouraging that negotiation for a decade, since 1988, since that Wings Club speech.
You're talking about the strategy of encirclement, I think.
I'm not sure I finished answering the question that you asked, because I think it's important. So most of the European partners with whom we might have conducted a negotiation, Germany would have been a much more attractive partner in terms of really demonstrating the importance of Open Skies than the Netherlands would have been. But they were very much in this camp of wanting to make sure that there was a unified European front. that they were not allowing us to pick off one after the other. The Dutch were willing to abandon that notion, become the leader of the pack, in effect. And as a result of the agreement, and I knew this would happen, they were more seen as pariahs for having done the Open Skies Agreement within Europe than the US was. I mean, they had broken the line and broken the back of what had been, I think, intended to be a united front.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was no question that the Dutch would end up becoming our first trading partner for Open Skies purposes, because nobody else would have stepped up to the plate.
Well, I don't know if you were part of the strategy of encirclement or that even occurred to you at the time. Did that not take place after you left office?
Well, there was a strategy. I think there was.
Maybe you could explain what that is and then comment on it.
Right. I think of it most conspicuously in the context of some of the late 1970s and early 1980s negotiations. Think of Japan. Japan was the essential destination in Asia at that time. China wasn't really on the map for aviation purposes quite yet. And so Tokyo was, if you will, Narita was the Heathrow of Asia, the essential destination. The Japanese, very much like the UK, knew that they were the essential destination and had no interest in any liberalization. But we weren't talking about open skies. We were just talking about deregulating some aspects of the flights between the US and Japan, and then using our rights beyond Japan to other places in Asia and Australasia. The Japanese were extremely tough on all of that. And so there was a concerted effort, I think, back in the 70s and early 80s to try to establish as many liberal agreements around Japan as possible, in effect threatening them with the loss of a lot of traffic. That is, people would start doing end runs around Japan. I think it was folly. At the end of the day, I don't think it really achieved anything. Japan stuck to its guns, right up until it was possible for them to get antitrust immunity for Japan Airlines and All Nippon, which, as we know, was just a few years ago. They never liberalized. So the encirclement that we talked about back then, I think, was ineffective. As an encirclement strategy, it was quite effective in establishing liberal agreements with a lot of other trading partners within Asia. I don't recall that we ever thought there could be encirclement within Europe. I mean, again, doing an open skies agreement with the Netherlands didn't encircle anybody. We still had real resistance coming from the UK. Real resistance coming from the UK. The UK, I mean, British Airways, remember, in 1992, right around the time we were doing an open skies agreement with the Dutch, came in and offered to invest $700 million in U.S. Air,
mm-hmm.
as was called at the time. $700 million at a time when U.S. Air was really on its knees. We had a huge interest in seeing whether we could facilitate that very important investment into U.S. Air, saving a tremendous number of jobs and keeping a competitor, an important competitor, alive in the U.S. market. But investing $700 million in U.S. Air meant that British Airways was in effect buying access to the U.S. domestic market. So I met with BA when we had that first conversation and said, you're buying access to the U.S. market. I'm intrigued with this, and I'd love to find a way to break through some of the restrictions on foreign ownership, which I'm sure we'll talk about at greater length in a few moments. But what exactly are you proposing to do for the benefit of U.S. carriers in your market in return for this opportunity that you've asked for? The result, the answer to the question was, well, we've calibrated this transaction very carefully. We're prepared to pay $700 million and not one penny more, meaning not one penny more in terms of any additional competition for us at Heathrow, thank you very much. That's the predicate upon which we're making this investment. Notwithstanding that answer, we nevertheless talked to the UK about an open skies agreement. We said we'd like to figure out a way to make this happen. We're intrigued with this. We think you should rescue US Airways, and this could be a new model for the cross-border flows of capital in this industry. But we really need an open skies agreement. We can't let this happen and still have you say only 2 airlines can fly to Heathrow. That doesn't work. The UK, notwithstanding a number of rounds that took place even at the ministerial level, Secretary Andy Card negotiated with his counterpart, John McDermott, I think was his name. We never got anywhere. So there was really no interest in open skies beyond the Dutch at that particular time.
Well, you mentioned antitrust immunity, and we have to talk about that in the context of the Dutch agreement and its consequences later for the creation of the alliances. Where did that idea come from at the time of the negotiation? Was it brought up by the airlines, or was it suggested by?
No, it came up from the airlines. I mean, we were not thinking that there would be a link in any way between immunizing alliances. Alliances were, pretty desultory affairs back then. They were very loose partnerships of airlines. They didn't have antitrust immunity, particularly. They couldn't really integrate their services very much.
But you did have KLM Northwest.
We had KLM Northwest.
I mean, that was the commercial predicate for this whole thing.
We had reviewed very carefully the KLM Northwest arrangement. That was presented to Secretary Skinner and me. It included an investment of $400 million, but we worked very carefully with the U.S. promoters of that alliance and had to be assured that there could be no semblance of any control by KLM in Northwest Airlines, because that would violate longstanding regulations and longstanding policy of the United States. So notwithstanding this pretty substantial investment KLM made in Northwest, the new Northwest at that time, there was a very loose alliance. The alliance was a very arm's length sort of thing, not integrated in any way. They had no immunity, and they really couldn't operate as one airline as they wanted to be. And so that had become a problem for them. And it was therefore that once we were seriously on the path toward open skies, I'm sure they presented it to us before we actually concluded the agreement, they came to us and said, one good thing that could come out of this would be, once you've got a clearly open market, once there's demonstrated contestability in the market, you don't have to worry about anybody monopolizing it permanently, because you've always got open entry. Anybody who wants to come in can, and we've got capacity as Schiphol to accommodate it. Why can't we begin to really integrate this alliance in ways that would create a different model for alliances generally? To do that, we really need to be immunized from spurious antitrust litigation, from whether Justice Department enforcement or private litigation. We needed antitrust immunity, they said, and we said, well, think about that.
Weren't you surprised by that? Did you find that a very dramatic request?
I thought it was a logical request.
Did you?
Yeah. I mean, it seemed to me that they were making a lot of sense. That I had felt that the restrictions on cross-border capital flows in the industry were a terrible anachronism. They were unseemly. They were strange. We didn't see any of that in virtually any other economic activity. There was some of that, of course, in publishing and telecommunications. Rupert Murdoch, remember, became a U.S. citizen so he could acquire the Wall Street Journal and all of that. So it wasn't completely unique to aviation, but it was pretty unique. And so I saw this effort to integrate services and the need for antitrust immunity in order to facilitate that as being sort of a logical next step. If we couldn't get rid of the restrictions on ownership, then this would be...
That's what was on your mind when this request was made. It was a way through the ownership issue.
Yeah, I
because you'd never exercised this power before, had you, in international aviation?
There'd been no occasion to.
No occasion to.
Right. We didn't have a completely open
Did you
market.
know about this power when you defined open skies? Did you even think about it as an issue?
No, we were thinking about it as not as part of open skies. No, we didn't have that in our...
It wasn't
head.
part of your template?
No.
Why?
It had not been presented because we thought there was benefit enough in simply getting out of the business of calibrating access to gateways in the U.S. We should just let airlines look at the map and decide as a commercial matter where they wanted to fly. That seemed to be to us an achievement worthy of the change.
Which it was.
Yeah, and I think quite honestly, if KLM and Northwest had not thought about antitrust immunity, had not come to us with the idea, if there had not been a decision to grant antitrust immunity, I think at the end of the day we still would have had a long list of open skies partners, because quite apart from the integration of the alliance, KLM had access to the U.S. market that exceeded anything any other non-U.S. airline enjoyed at that time. Maybe this is what you meant by encirclement. That became a threat, if you will. Encirclement seems like the wrong metaphor, but it certainly became a threat to the others. And I think, quite apart from antitrust immunity, eventually others would have had to step up to the plate.
A threat and an enticement. The idea of an antitrust immunity, because Lufthansa and United followed in
Yeah,
short
but what
order.
I'm saying is, even if we hadn't gone that further step, if it had not been presented, we'd never had to think about antitrust immunity, I think there would have been enough incentive to other trading partners
Yeah.
to do open skies, so we would have had eventually all the same open skies agreements that we had.
Even without antitrust immunity,
I think so,
you do.
yeah.
Well, amazingly, we've come to our the end of our second hour, so we will take a break and resume with the US-EU Air Transport Agreement.
Good.